Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor is a professor of psychology at the University of Arizona, where she directs the Grief, Loss, and Social Stress Lab, investigating the effects of grief on the brain and the body. Dr. O'Connor holds a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Arizona and completed a postdoctoral fellowship in psychoneuroimmunology at the UCLA Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior. Dr. O'Connor's book, The Grieving Brain, was included on Oprah's list of best books to comfort a grieving friend, and her new book is titled The Grieving Body: How the Stress of Loss Can Be an Opportunity for Healing. And Dr. O'Connor lives with MS. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. O'Connor.
It's lovely to be here, John.
In the opening pages of your book, you write, loss due to chronic illness and loss due to bereavement both involve the unbearable cloak of grieving, weighing on you every day, shaping what you think, what you do, and your beliefs about the future. Shaping what you think, what you do, and your beliefs about the future. Tell me about that.
Mm. I've been studying grief, the response to loss for all of my career for over 25 years now. And my own experience of having MS was very much that I could relate to people who had experienced the death of a loved one who didn't quite know how to function in the world without that person, in part because of similarly not knowing how I was going to be able to function in the world with the symptoms of MS or the uncertainty of the future because of having MS. And so the overlap seemed really clear to me. And I think I benefited a lot from understanding how grieving works as I tried to adapt to my own diagnosis.
May I ask when you were diagnosed and what your MS journey has been like?
Yeah, I was about 26 years old when I was diagnosed. And what's interesting about it that I understand better now is that my mother died about a year before I was diagnosed. Now, I'm very, very clear. I understand the immunology. My mother's loss didn't cause my MS. I have a family history. My dad's aunt has MS. And I have a number of other risk factors. So it's not terribly surprising ultimately that I developed MS. But the timing of when it became clear, when my symptoms became so disruptive that I sought medical treatment, no longer surprises me that it was during the stress of grieving for my mom that my body really wasn't able to be resilient enough to sort of maintain health. And so when I was diagnosed, they told me, well, the first 5 years will tell you a lot about what your MS is going to look like. And I thought, what? How 5 years? Like, how does anyone make any decisions about their life, as a 26-year-old, if it's going to be that long to figure out what this is going to feel like? And of course, what I find interesting about that is bereaved people also take a long time to adapt to a life without their spouse or their child or their parent or whomever it is. And so it's another parallel there. My initial symptoms were paresthesia, the sort of tingling type feelings most people describe that way, and overwhelming fatigue and some vertigo as well. So most of my symptoms have been in the sensory domain more so than the muscle, or it doesn't affect my gait or my vision, for example.
Living with MS often means living with loss.
Yeah.
And depending upon the level of disability someone might be experiencing, that sense of loss can be profound.
Yeah.
Grieving is a common response to loss. How might grieving physically affect an individual?
It's such a good question. I think that most of us aren't aware that even grieving the death of a loved one is actually a physical response as well as an emotional response. And so we know, even in bereavement research, that we see changes in the immune system and we see changes in the cardiovascular system. So, for example, research of mine and now research in bigger studies from other labs shows that people who are grieving the death of a loved one often have increased inflammation. So, inflammation being a response of the immune system ordinarily to something like a bacteria or a virus, but inflammation can occur under conditions of chronic stress as well. So, we know that grief, in the traditional sense, grieving over a loved one, can cause changes in inflammation. What I think we also have come to understand is that our chronic stress response to all sorts of losses in our life can include changes in our immune system. When we are having a stress reaction that might include increased adrenaline to cope with a stressor or increased cortisol to cope with a stressor, those things affect our immune system. Those hormones affect our immune system as well and can make us more susceptible to viruses or colds, for example, when we're undergoing that chronic stress. So, with MS, it's even more complex because those of us with MS have an immune system that is often highly reactive, or we take medications that are already impacting our immune competence. And so I think that knowing the similarities can help us psychologically. One final example that I will give you that I have found very useful is that we know there's two common responses that people have after the death of a loved one, called protest and despair. And we actually see this even in animals, even in infants, through attachment research. We see protest and despair. And protest is if you imagine looking down and your child isn't next to you in the grocery store where you were expecting them to be. That feeling, that energized feeling of, oh no, what's happened? Where are they? Right? That's the feeling of protest. And despair is, oh no, they are really gone. That very withdrawn, the feeling of being dragged down by the reality. Well, many people will describe those two responses to a diagnosis as well. This can't be happening. What is, no, this isn't right. And also, oh, I have to live with this forever, right? And so when in protest, often we're, well, I can speak for myself, the idea of, no, I can do anything, even though I have this diagnosis, right? I can work all the hours and I can walk all the blocks and so forth because I can't believe this is real. And on the flip side, the despair of, I will never be able to do anything. I'll never be able to get my degree, or I'll never be able to have children or whatever because I have this, is sort of a part of despair. And those are natural responses, but sometimes it helps to know that those are part of grieving and that they're temporary responses. We can work with those so that we can find a way to still create a meaningful life, whether our loss is of a loved one or whether it is of health.
We've touched on the physical impact of grieving, the emotional impact of grieving. What's the cognitive impact of grieving?
Many people will describe having difficulty thinking after the death of a loved one. Some people now use the term brain fog. And one of the things that's challenging, I write about this in The Grieving Body, is that actually everyone uses brain fog in a slightly different way. So different people mean different things when they say brain fog. Some people mean I parked my car and then I come back and I can't find it. And other people mean can't somehow carry the one when I'm trying to do my taxes. So people mean different things when they say brain fog. What we see from neuropsychological research on bereavement after the death of a loved one is that there's a very small decline in overall what we would call global cognition. And what that mostly means is that there's no specific part of the brain that's broken after a loved one dies. But that doesn't mean it's not real, that people aren't experiencing brain fog. So, what we think is going on is that when a loved one dies, every single situation you are in, you suddenly have to relearn. You're in the grocery store and you're just doing your shopping and you pull the soy milk off the shelf and you put it in the basket, and then you remember, oh, my daughter who's lactose intolerant and drinks soy milk isn't with us anymore. I don't have to buy soy milk. And you put it back on the shelf, right? So the simple act of just doing the grocery shopping suddenly requires all this mental and emotional energy. So I think that the reason that our brain doesn't seem to be working quite right is more like, have you ever been trying to like type a document on your computer while in the background your computer is downloading some program? And the typing doesn't work quite right. Like the letters sputter out and then there's a pause, and there's nothing wrong with your computer. Your computer is not broken. It is just really using all its processing power in the background, and that's preventing you from doing the task in the foreground that you'd like to be doing. I think of grieving as a similar thing. Your brain is really busy trying to process what has happened and help you to function in your day to day life, but it's taking extra time to do that.
It seems to me that in those moments when your brain is trying to function and
Yeah.
that other stuff is going on in the background, when you have that realization, when you're in the supermarket and you have to put that item back on the shelf, that
Yeah.
also becomes a trigger in that
Yeah.
moment, doesn't it?
That's right. Exactly. So it's not like you just have to learn a new set of habits because you're taller now or something. You have to learn a new set of habits because something really devastating has happened. And so these are triggers then for emotional moments. I can tell you, I myself have gotten teared up in the middle of the grocery store. I think we've all had experiences of being caught off guard by a wave of grief after loved ones have died. And that takes its own energy and effort, sort of a toolkit of coping strategies to try to figure out how to get through just your regular grocery trip after a loved one has died.
So, how do people cope with grieving, and how can those coping behaviors affect someone's physical health?
I like to think about the idea that we can have a big toolkit of coping strategies, because it turns out that in different situations, you need different strategies to cope with a wave of grief. So, the strategy that I might use if I'm just about to walk into a work meeting and I'm finding myself thinking about my dad who has died is going to be a different strategy that I'm going to use than on a Saturday afternoon when I'm on the phone with my sister and I'm thinking about our dad having died. And so I think just knowing that you have a lot of choices, right? So in the moment before I'm going into a work meeting, I think denial and avoidance is a totally appropriate strategy. You can sort of say to yourself, you know what? I can't get upset about this right now. I really have to be able to go in and do my work here. I'm going to put a pin in this and I'm going to think about it later. But right now, I'm going to pretend it never happened. If that's the only coping strategy that you have, I'm not going to think about this. That's probably not going to help you adapt very well in the long term. But as one of your coping strategies, that's perfectly fine. If you also have the strategy of being able to talk with people about what your loved one meant to you and how important those memories are to you, how much that they continue to influence your life, and the sadness and yearning you might have, or the guilt or anger that you might have, finding ways to talk about those with people you're close with who are able to offer you comfort or even just witness your experience, how difficult this is for you. That's a different type of coping strategy of relying on your support system and being able to talk through what you're feeling and thinking. And those types of ways of addressing waves of grief over the long term, the vast majority of us are surprisingly resilient. we do come to develop a life that includes waves of grief, but less intensely and less frequently than early on after a loss. Becoming familiar with a wave of grief, knowing that it will well up, but it will also recede like a wave, can be very reassuring as we sort of get through the days and then weeks and then months and even years. Grief doesn't actually go away. The fact that you have a loss is just always going to be true. But we get better at learning how to have grief and how to have a lot of other feelings and thoughts, activities as well.
As you were describing one of those coping mechanisms in particular, I thought to myself, just last month was MS Awareness Month, and
Yeah.
in that month was MS Awareness Week. And the
Hmm.
National MS Society, what they invited people to do was to talk to their MS, to,
Yeah.
and many of them put up videos and what have you, but just kind of telling your MS how you felt about it.
That is beautiful. And I think it's such an important, it sounds a little bit strange, but we have a relationship with this body, with these symptoms, with these experiences. And I love the idea of being able to express something to your body or your symptoms or your experiences. Everything from there's a guided meditation that I do. And one of the phrases in the meditation is about thanking your body for the things that it is able to do for you. And I've always found it deeply moving because when you're struggling with things that your body won't do or won't do regularly, or you don't know if it's going to be able to do them, it can be really easy to forget that it is actually doing all sorts of things for you all the time. And that feeling of gratitude really shifts, I think. You can have anger or frustration and gratitude at the same time. And that's a very different experience than only having anger or frustration.
It's important. So, what's the path forward for someone who may be grieving the loss of a loved one or someone who may be living with a particularly aggressive or progressive case of multiple sclerosis? What's their path to a better sense of well being?
Think it's important to know that we can have a disease, we can be grieving, and we can also have mental health. Both can be true. And I think that for many of us, mental health is about being able to fully participate in the life that we are living even with the constraints that that life has. And so, for me, I knew that I wasn't going to be able to do all the things that I had wanted to do when I was 26 before I was diagnosed. And I also knew that I could fully enjoy the things that I was able to do. And so I hesitate to say something that sounds like rose-colored glasses because that is not actually, I think, the best form of mental health. Rose-colored glasses often exclude things that are happening for people, right? And so I think about the idea of having a rich life, incorporate the good things and the bad things, and finding the ways to connect with other people, especially around, well, around both celebrating the good things and also allowing people to share the burden when things are really difficult and to find ways that they may be meaningful. I'll give you a simple example. When my dad was older, he needed to stop driving. And he was really struggling with this. And I said to him at one point, he'd had a car accident and it was really important. He really needed to stop. And I said to him at one point, I said, Dad, my memory of you when I was a kid was that you used to go pick people up in your car and take them to church and take them to doctor's appointments. And he said, Yeah. And I said, Did you enjoy doing that? And he was like, Oh, absolutely. I felt so connected with my neighborhood and I got to hear great stories from older folks. And I said, Dad, this is the time to give that gift to someone else. Someone else wants to drive you. Someone else wants the opportunity to feel useful. And that really shifted things for him. I think he felt like less of a burden and more like this is just the fabric of the people in our lives. And we do the things to make that fabric work in the places that make sense.
The name of the book is The Grieving Body: How the Stress of Loss Can Be an Opportunity for Healing. Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor, I want to thank you for helping people find a way forward when their lives have been interrupted in the saddest and sometimes most tragic ways. And thanks so much for talking with me today.
Thanks so much for bringing this conversation to people. It was good to talk to you, John.